and Bruce E. There's a Monty Python skit. G'day, Bruce, and g'day, Bruce. The three professors. Okay.
Shep, you're on.
All right. Welcome to the Winter Disruptive Technologists webinar. Thanks for attending. This is the Winter Fireside chat on Tech Disrupts Democracy. It's basically just going to be a Q&A where we answer some of the attendees' questions and kind of go into a little bit more of a informal dialogue about technology, democracy, etc. We just wanted to give some quick thanks to a few of the sponsors that have been with Disruptive Tech along the way. Esther Dyson for supporting Disruptive Tech's monthly newsletter, the Microsoft Reactor for supporting Disruptive Tech's mission over the past few years, Upflex Office Spaces, where they give 5 webinar attendees 2-day free passes to use globally, and Hint Water for being a longtime sponsor. And with that, I'm going to just hand it over to Bruce Epstein, the knowledge transfer wizard at Abis AI, which is a company based in France, but Bruce is actually over here in New York City with us. So to you, Bruce.
Thanks, Sep, and looking forward to a rousing and fascinating discussion, as we always have here at Disruptive Technologists. So real quick, just who's on our panel tonight, and alphabetical order by your first names. So we have Bruce Bachenheimer, who's a professor at Pace University. His specialty is entrepreneurship, and he's the director of the Entrepreneur Lab at Pace. We have Micah Sifry, who is the co-founder and president of Civic Hall, New York City's Community Center for Civic Tech Innovation. We have Richard Hill, founder and CEO of VoteOurVoice, among other things, with the mission of providing voters with a way to hold their politicians accountable while they're in office. And Tristan Lewis, or Louis, I don't know, president and CEO of Casebook PBCs, a serial entrepreneur, and a published thought leader on digital innovation. Thank you all for being with us tonight. So our first question, and this is US centric because that's where we are currently holding our events. In the latest election, we actually set a record for participation at 2/3 of the eligible voters turned out. But that number actually pales in comparison with many other democratic societies around the world that routinely obtain 70, 80% or greater participation. So in your opinions, is technology helping our cause, hurting our cause, and what should it be doing to increase participation?
Well, I'll take a stab to start. Just in the research that I've done on democracies around the world, in many countries where they have democracies, they also have, in large countries like India, voting is mandatory. So it's not a technology issue as much as it is one that would be more legislative. So if we want to have a greater participation rate here in the United States, then we can do things like give people a day off to go and vote, and then also make it compulsory. So if that would, short of that, what we saw on a voluntary basis of 70%, and the fact that it is the largest percentage of active voters that have participated in an election, it's great for us. Also, we've got huge numbers. Other countries that are smaller, have more intimate settings, it's easier for them to contain and to use more technology. Like you see in Eastern Europe, where you can actually vote online in places in different countries there. So I think that it's coming here. We'll get to that point. But I think that the first step would be to make it compulsory in the United States.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think that there's a lot of forces in the U.S. that don't want high voter turnout, whether it's technology, there's no reason you can't use blockchain or simple technology like just putting your finger in permanent ink. But I think particularly one of the political parties will do everything they can to keep voter turnout down, regardless of technology advancements or desire to vote, whether it's voting early, voting by mail, voting online, et cetera. And I was going to say, to continue Richard's point, I work for an Australian company and spent a couple of years at grad school in Australia. And yeah, they have compulsory voting. You're fined if you don't, and they reach 94% voter participation rates. I have to say, over next.
Well, actually, one of those things that I would say in terms of overseas versus the United States when it comes to voter participation is ultimately because there's been an undermining of civics in the United States and the responsibility of the citizenry to actually get involved in its political system. You do not see that in other democratic countries. In other democratic countries, there is a responsibility that is understood by anyone, and not just white collar people, but even the blue collar population, that it is a responsibility, it is part of your role as a citizen to get engaged, and that the minimum bar is to get involved in voting.
Well, my view is that the United States is doing about as well as many similar countries. UK voter turnout, 63%. It's not that different. We have historically, very unusually, barriers to just making it possible to vote. Most countries don't have voter registration. And that's part of our history as the United States is in a developing country. It's not a full democracy. The notion that democracy won, prevailed, I think was the word used, is a laugh, but it's a myth. It's a useful myth that we say that we're the world's greatest democracy. Maybe someday we will be. And voting is just part of it. But when you live under a constitution that gives, say, Idaho, which has Wyoming, fewer residents of Wyoming than the District of Columbia. Wyoming has 2 senators. The District of Columbia has 0 senators. So we have all sorts of deformations that really put the lie to us being a full democracy. And the barriers to voting are just one of the bigger ones. As for where technology can help, a lot. The folks at TurboVote, which started out as with the idea that it would be like, Netflix sending you in a package the way we used to get DVDs from Netflix, that you would get your absentee ballot that way. They have, last I checked, well over 6 million people they were communicating with through text messaging in 2020 to send them reminders on when the deadlines were to register, to help you track your ballot. We ought to be able to track our ballots as easily as we can track a package on UPS. And you can do that with TurboVote. So the technology can absolutely help make it easier. It's a little bit frustrating that we even have to do that. The government ought to make it easy from the start. But yes, tech can definitely be a lubricant, if you will, to make it easier.
And one other comment on voting. That's right, we don't have a direct voting and direct democracy. I just point out in other countries, since we mentioned that, remember Switzerland, there's a term, I can't pronounce it correctly, but it used to be all the men would gather in the town square with their sword and hold it up, and they would vote on everything. I can imagine pushing democracy down, not just to members of Congress or the president, but they would vote on whether, what I recall, Switzerland was going to buy F-16s, and individual citizens voted. Is that where our money should go? So one thing about having a direct democracy and pushing the things you vote on down could take a lot of corruption and whatnot out of the process. I mean, it's a little bit like all those props, in California. Start voting on everything. Imagine if it was easy to do that and it was a true direct democracy.
Bruce, to your point, that brings an excellent segues us into an excellent point here. So I did a little research on the last 2 terms of Congress that took us over 4 years. I'll ask the panel, take a guess at how many pieces of legislation were proposed in the 4 years, in the past 4 years.
I know in the Senate there was nothing done.
Well, lots of bills get introduced, but very, very few were actually deliberated and voted on.
It deliberated in the Senate was like virtually nothing.
Yeah. A lot of post offices got renamed, I think.
Right. So would you believe 25,000 out of 25,000 bills that were introduced, 3% actually passed. So we had literally less than 750 bills out of 25,000. Now here's an interesting point to you, Bruce, is that in VoteOurVoice, we actually built a system that provides direct democracy. So people can vote on bills that have been brought to the floor within a 90-day window, and they can tell their congressman or their senator which way what they want them to do on that particular bill. Here becomes the problem, though, and I'd be interested in, from the panel, how we address this issue. So 25,000 bills or different referendums, etc., is tantamount to 520 per month. None of us are going to spend the time to leaf through or 520 pieces of legislation at any level, even if it's a paragraph. It's unrealistic. So the first problem that we have to solve is we have to stop the redundancy, because I fail to believe that our 2 houses are actually introducing 25,000 pieces of legislation that are not redundant. Right? These guys, we're in the process of doing some research in terms of what systems are in place that let a congressman know who else is building similar legislation on a particular topic, and where they're, where the parts of the Venn diagram intersect. But from a voter and just a citizen of the United States, these people are literally just doing our bidding 3% of the time. 3%. So 97% of what they're doing when they're, as we call them, lawmakers, which is a bit of a joke. I think that if any of us only did our job 3% of the time, you'd be hard pressed to say, well, 3% of the time I build bridges. The other 97% of the time, I'm doing whatever I want, working on my golf game or whatever. It really doesn't matter. It disenfranchises many people from the system, gives certainly young people it validates the fact that they believe that politics can't change. These numbers are just insurmountable. I mean, we don't see that in Canada. We don't see that in the UK. There's definitely not this voluminous legislation being proposed where people are doing so just to justify their existence and clip money and clip their paycheck. So then we could get into the economic parts of that. And I can tell you that just looking at the salaries of these politicians, it's about $100 million a year wasted in lack of productivity.
To be honest, this is in all fairness, that's really not a very fair argument about what members of Congress and their staffs do. There's all kinds of other things that they do in addition to introducing and sponsoring bills. So I agree with you. They're definitely not working as hard as they could be, given how much time they have to spend raising money and how much time they spend back in their districts. But they would say time in the district is time listening to their constituents, and they do an awful amount of constituent service, which helps get them reelected. There are flaws, but I object to putting it quite as starkly as where you were going. I would rather that members of Congress get paid more so that they didn't have to spend any time on fundraising. I'd love to see them have their campaigns draw from public funds so that they're not dependent on private money. The amount of time, one reason why a member of Congress like AOC is so productive as a watchdog, when she sits at a hearing, she comes well prepared because she's spending no time dialing for dollars. And the reason she spends no time dialing for dollars is she's figured out how to use social media to bring in the money instead. And that's maybe partly because she's of that generation, and some of it may be because of her politics, but there's nothing stopping from other members of Congress from doing the same thing. But most of them are spending hours every day in little rooms, one at a time, calling people, asking them for big checks.
Right.
And how does that benefit us, though?
I'm sorry?
I was
How
going to
does
say,
that benefit us, right? We
It
are
doesn't.
the
It doesn't.
taxpayers, we're the people. And what I'm saying is, I get why the politician is incentivized. They want to keep the seat as long as possible.
Of course.
But for the rest of us who depend on them to actually get things done, I just have very little compassion for that part of the job. I'm like, look, you got to do our work. Figuring out your money situation. Again, it's not doing the people's work, it's doing their personal work. They're the only one who benefits from fundraising, right?
well, a lot of times they have to raise funds for the party in order to get their committee seats, etc. So there's like a minimum you have to raise, not even for your own campaign, but the fact that you have to raise so much for your own campaign to stay competitive, as opposed to public financing, but also to move up in the party for chairmanships and all that, you have to do it. I was going to address the initial point I thought you might have been going with is that with these thousands of bills, if it comes to 500 a day, how could you expect citizens to vote on all of them if we want to work towards a direct democracy? One thing might be, there's the famous line, don't tell me what you believe in, show me your budget and I'll tell you what you believe in. Perhaps even just voting for a breakdown, what percent goes to the military, what goes to infrastructure, what goes to, etc., and then let the politicians work in those.
Well, there's been some interesting work around that. In New York City, for example, it is possible to give advice. There's a participatory budget process where you can go to the website and say, those kinds of things are things that you should be putting more money in, and those are the things that you should be putting less money in. But it goes to also kind of decision fatigue, right? Because the only people that go to those kinds of things are the people that really care about those issues. And that's true. That's the factor, is that there's actually a very good 1970s movie called The Rise and Rise of Michael Rimmer. It's a piece of fiction, but it goes to that point, that idea that essentially you push to a participatory democratic model. And this guy is basically taking that to drive to decision fatigue so that he essentially becomes a fascist leader for the country as a result of it. Most people elect their representative because they're expecting them to do the work for them. Most people are actually not, they're like, okay, broadly defined, this is how I hope you're thinking about this, and I'm going to let you figure it out.
That's the part that I think has to change, right, Tristan? Is that a democracy, the politicians use this catch-all slogan of, I'm the agent of change, I'm change agent, right? So vote for me because I'm going to change things. Well, and it's very, it's odd to me that people actually buy into that, because democracy in its definitional purpose is participation of all of us and people. It's not one person changing. If we want democracy to change, we have to change. We have to change so a direct democracy, or at least having a system that has a chance of surviving in a direct democracy, meaning fewer legislative issues being brought to the floor, more thought given to that. We can certainly, with our data, tell the politicians what people want and where to go. I mean, we actually already have that data now where they can start to do that. But it has to be, and it would be a two-way street, but they wouldn't feel the need to then say, to then justify their existence by just fruits of labor that go nowhere.
Well, the challenge with the direct democracy model, right, is that we have the closest thing to a direct democracy model happening every 4 years in the form of the popular vote, right? We've got two groups, generally two candidates, and you're going to choose one versus the other in terms of how they embody a certain set of ideals versus the other. It doesn't necessarily translate into actually who wins, right? Because the Electoral College kind of destroys some of that model, but it gives you an indication of what a direct democracy might look like. And right now, in a country that is extremely divided, direct democracy might actually be even more inefficient than what we're having.
Yeah, it could, because that's all a representative democracy, right? When we elect them, they could do whatever they want. But I was going to say, to be controversial, I actually looking, a democracy needs two things: a free press and informed electorate. Based on what you're hearing with the last election, I don't think we have an informed electorate. And to be controversial, I'd say we should have a minimum civics test to allow you to vote, and have less people vote that are more informed. And these complete idiots shouldn't be allowed to vote. Not a poll tax, not based on wealth or college degree, but basic civics and belief in reality.
Well, we give immigrants tests, right? And
right.
They know more about civics when
Look
they
at the last
Tuberville
doesn't know how many branches of government there are.
Right. You'll get no pushback from me.
How about if we just had a civics test in order to be a candidate rather than in order to be a voter? I think the idea that we would impose some sort of test, which in all honesty, Bruce, I appreciate, it's, fun to shoot the breeze, but and I know that such a test would be used in the same way that all the others have been used to keep people of color, poor people, immigrants out of full participation. But members of Congress ought to have some basic civic literacy, and it's hard to tell if all of them do. So that
it's easy to tell.
There are newspapers which used to have more influence over the process than they do now, sometimes would, as part of their process of endorsing, they would ask candidates those kinds of basic questions. The same thing would sometimes happen in debates. And then we, the voters, could maybe get a sense of whether or not these candidates had basic competence. And I do think that that wouldn't be a bad thing if we could somehow set that up as one of the steps along the way. However, obviously, since the last 4 years have taught us, there's a big chunk of the public that resents the idea that some elites are deciding for them who should be, in charge. And we have some politicians who have learned how to use that as a way, to leverage their own popularity.
And also, if you go back to the Electoral College, it wasn't just to screw up the vote or to represent small states. The initial purpose was that we didn't get, a Donald Trump, a king, someone who would just appeal to the masses. The idea was that the population was too stupid and gullible to vote, that we should have these electors could vote, so we wouldn't get a charismatic king. The Hamilton electors, that was break glass in emergency. It wasn't about
The-
slavery or representing small states. It was the population is too stupid.
So I'm actually with Micah in terms of like at least a requirement of basic civics. I actually took the test. I'm a naturalized citizen.
Mhm.
It's literally 125 questions that you've got to learn, right? And they quiz you on 20 of them out of 125. It is not a hard test.
Right.
I think, any second grader probably can pass that test. So it is a test on the fundamentals. How many houses of governments are there? How many stars on the flag? Yeah. Who's the leader of the country, and things like that. Simple things, right? And I think that I agree with Mika that those simple things should be probably the first test. But I think what you're highlighting here, Mika, which is interesting, is also a change that has been driven by technology. When you're talking about newspapers, when you're talking about debate, you're talking about an editor sitting in the middle there that's actually doing some level of vetting of our candidates. Social media, Twitter in particular, has allowed for politicians to bypass that vetting system, to completely go to their potential constituents and use that as a way to directly communicate with their constituents. And that's where I think those platforms in general are going to have to think about their responsibility in terms of potentially being the filter or partially being the filter when it comes to elections.
Yeah.
What?
I just published an edition of my newsletter, The Connector, talking to a communications professor at Michigan State University who studied the impact of Facebook and other social media on the local, what she called the local information infrastructure, or the local political information infrastructure. And she found two really interesting things. She looked at how elected officials, local government, community organizations, libraries, other civic actors around Lansing, Michigan, how they use Facebook, and then interviewed a lot of their communications staff and asked them, how is it changing the world that they operate in? And she found two really, really striking findings. It's true that Facebook makes it a lot cheaper to communicate with the public or with targeted audiences. If you were an organization in the past, you would send your press release, you're the League of Women Voters, you send your press release to the local newspaper, and maybe they send a reporter to your event, and that's how you get the word out to the public. And so one of the things that everybody says is, no one covers our events anymore. And that's because newspapers are dying in many places. Their business model is getting weaker. But what's replacing it, as these actors, civic organizations, and so on, politicians all use Facebook, is two things that are not good. First of all, there's less accountability, because nobody using these tools has an incentive to investigate themselves. That's what independent journalism does. And if we lose that, we lose local political accountability. The other thing, which was even more invidious, is because of the way that dialogue on Facebook plays out, people who are angry get amplified. People who are happy, maybe they just like something. And so all of these organizations have learned to avoid controversial subjects because it leads to toxic engagement on their Facebook pages. And they don't want that. They want happy engagement. They want people to give them money, and they want people to feel good about the organization. So the result is, she called it the evaporation of politics, as a result of how Facebook is, in effect, disrupting and supplanting old media in local politics. And I think it's a really important thing to realize, that we are the environment that a lot of us grew up in is not the environment that people are operating in anymore. And Facebook isn't really living up to its responsibilities to be a, actually responsible member of the community and step in. And I don't want them to play this role, quite frankly. I don't trust Mark Zuckerberg at all to take it seriously. But somebody has to play that sort of editorial community role, and they're not doing it.
Just to point, I always think obviously history is interesting. And if you look at, the great three networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, and the trusted news journalist, Walter Cronkite, et cetera, the basic model, and it wasn't financially driven, was the airwaves belong to America, the American people. If you want to broadcast ABC, NBC, or CBS, in return, you will provide news. It was a lost leader. They weren't making money on the news, but those news bureaus and that information they were providing was in return for using our airwaves. And when you took the financial incentive out of it, and smaller numbers, it was a very different approach. And the other thing with local is not just the policy, but the corruption. There's no one there to expose the graft, the corruption, the pollution, the no-show jobs, all the other things with local investigative journalists.
Right.
I don't know if people are looking at, hi everyone, organizer here, just kind of watching in the background, but I don't know if you're looking at the chat, but Micah just sent a piece on Facebookification of local life. If you have the chat and you can see it, he's got the link, and it might be something really interesting to look at. I can read it off really fast if you can't see it, but it's the connector.substack.com/the-Facebookification -of-local-life. And if anyone can't grab that in the meantime and they want to know more, you can email me at info@disruptivetechnologists.com, and I'll send you any information. And Jess, Bruce Epstein, don't mean to step on your toes, but there's a couple of other people who are talking. I don't know if everyone's watching the chat, but it is a fireside chat, so we kind of have to look at the chat stuff. But someone said something about the liquefaction of, I'm not.
There was a question about liquid democracy.
Yeah, does anyone know about that? I haven't heard of it.
Sure. That is an idea that, that term comes out of Germany, I think, where it was promoted by the Green Party. And the idea is more of a flexible system. It isn't direct democracy, but more where you can give your proxy to somebody else. So the Greens in Germany, for example, in Berlin, were experimenting with this. They actually built a platform to do it. And the idea was that the members of the local Green Party all had a vote on what their elected officials on the city council would say and do on policy questions. But if you're not an expert, say, on housing, you could give your proxy to someone else and say, now they have two votes because you trust them to represent your views. And that was the idea. That's the liquid piece of this, is that you, in effect, delegate other people. You could withdraw that delegation whenever you wanted, and that all of this would allow for more of a back and forth between voters and their representatives in real time. That's the other part of it that's supposed to be liquid, compared to, say, once every 2 years, we vote and then they go off and do whatever they want to do. Nice idea in theory, very, very challenging to put into practice. I spent an afternoon talking to one of the local Greens in Berlin about this the last time I was there a few years ago. And what he said is, it turns out it didn't work, number one, because they had to really, it was a difficult system to explain to people, and they didn't have a good system for onboarding. So only a few thousand members of the local Greens started using it. But then the other thing that happened, which was sort of an unintended consequence, is that instead of building up a more vibrant back and forth between voters and their representatives, it created a second system of representation. So people who are really good at winning liquid democracy proxies came to have their own power base within the party, and they became like it created tension rather than harmony. And I don't know if people have figured out how to solve that. I think it's a good thing to try for new approaches. Maybe other folks here have seen more recent examples of this. I think the Greens have eventually abandoned it.
Yeah, the challenge in any kind of system like this where you are dealing through proxies is that it becomes about the aggregation of proxies. And so your power, I mean, the power structure, it exists in a number of other environments. I mean, I see it on my, New York City co-op board, where basically when it comes to the elections, the gathering of proxies is what's going to guarantee you a seat on the board. And it's, in as simple a structure like this, it is an issue. So the minute you are dealing with something at a citywide level or a county or even the countrywide level, the problems only get magnified. And so it drives to then the ability to organize, to gather proxies, not even to organize to get out the votes, which is, a somewhat harder problem.
And then I don't know if anyone else saw Simon's questions. He's been kind of asking a lot of stuff. Simon, if you want to go ahead and I think, I don't know if you're looking at his stuff, but I think he's got some interesting ideas on his chat. I don't know, Bruce, if you want to talk to any of them. One of them was, that's Steve, actually. Steve said, are any of you familiar with Liquid? We did that. And then Simon said, isn't a civics test to vote a strike against democracy? Who sets the test? I guess that would be for Tristan, since he's the only one who's taken it.
Yeah, so I mean, when it comes to citizenship, the test is actually set by the US government, and it's distributed under the Department of Homeland Security, and because that's where your Immigration and Naturalization Department is sitting. The test, I think, was set by Congress a long time ago and has got, stayed pretty much the same since. It is, I think the way you set it up is that you don't necessarily make it a vote, a test to vote, but you make it a test to graduate high school. That you can't graduate high school if you do not have those basics of civics. When I come from the French system, and in the French system, we actually have civics classes, not history classes, we literally have civics classes for three of the high school years. And it is about the role of you go into the role of the citizenry, your responsibility to the state, why you have to vote, why you have to keep yourself informed, what are the current issues that exist. And it's about preparing people that are going to graduate high school, even in vocational schools, to become good citizens, because there's that investment basically from the government in the citizenry and the idea that we can't function as a country unless you have people that are participating in the democracy. It does not solve the problem, by the way, of participation of extreme elements. I mean, we have as much extremism in France as we do in the United States, but it does drive to people actually thinking about those issues and thinking about them prior to the elections. I think the last presidential election had an 87% participation rate, which was horrifying to people because it was low.
I'm from Southern California, and I don't remember having any civics classes or any civics lessons when I was in high school. It's funny that you have all that.
Well, there's a part of me that believes that it's actually part of a longer trend. So, if you plant it back to the Reagan era, where Reagan would go out and say that, the scariest word to the American people is that we're from the government and we're here to help, there was a political plan put in place by the GOP that creating support for the government was a bad idea, and that undermining the concept that the government is useful was politically viable in terms of gaining seats of power. And that effort started in the 80s. We're now 40 years later, and we're seeing the results of that.
So now to ask all of you, what tech can we use to help democracy? I mean, what exact tech things? I mean, Richard, you got data out of your ears. Bruce Bachenheimer, you've like studied some tech. What tech can we talk to people about for democracy?
Well, from our end, what we're doing in terms of offering a solution, we've come up with a way that we can actually provide people information on both candidates, not just the candidate that's incumbent, because our data is really geared towards the person who has the job and their voting history and measuring. So let me step back and tell you how it works. A person registers on the site, they pick the topics they care about. It provides summaries of actual legislation. They vote on that legislation and it gets compared against what the politicians actually did. And so you get three things in a report card: you versus the politician. So it tells you what are the differences between the way you think and the way the politician actually voted. Secondly, you versus the voting district. So you can see the differences between you and people around you. Lastly is the voting district or the state versus the politician. So you can, and that's really the measure as to whether or not they're doing their job. So in this past election, we actually had this came up late in the process with the idea, you know what, if we have someone running against, or there's two, like in the case of Arizona, where you have two people running for a Senate seat that are they're brand new, there is no voting history and so forth, we can actually give them large numbers of summaries to vote on. They authorize us to allow the general population to measure their votes against it, and then actually see which one on a numerical basis will do the better job representing how people actually think. And it's just a matter of stats. And so what we thought would happen here is that because the second part of that report card is you versus the politician, you versus your voting district, in terms of, when you get your personalized report card, each politician that's already used VoteOurVoice already knows how well their ideas match up with the people in their voting district. So if they had a low score, they'd be, and that score was lower than the engagement of the people versus the politician, which they could also see, then they might say, oh, I don't want to provide that information and don't want to participate. To which we would respond by telling everybody, hey, here's the deal. We gave them the opportunity on the numbers. They chose not to provide those numbers to you, hence telling people the score of the incumbent is actually higher than what this person can provide. Or in the case where two people, if one of them does, neither one of them has is disincentivized to not provide it, but it comes down to data. And so we're really pushing people should make more of these decisions based on data versus political loyalty or emotion, because it doesn't really, if we're going to do that, then we might as well drop the voting age.
I think Bruce Bachenheimer has something. What are you going to say, Bruce?
No, that would be great. And again, I was just trying to be a little controversial with the test, but when you think about it, people aren't voting based on rationality or their own self-interest. People are voting on their tribe. Listen, someone made the analogy, if you're a Yankees fan and I convince you that Boston is a better team, are you going to switch from being a Yankees fan to a Red Sox fan or a Catholic to a Muslim? You're not. You're voting that person. the Democrats are evil. They got pedophiles in the basement of pizzerias. I'm only voting, so I love the idea of data, but again, the premise of a real democracy is an informed electorate. And again, in our Constitution, as Ruth Bader Ginsburg pointed out, one person, one vote is nowhere in there. The Electoral College, to avoid people picking a charismatic king, is in there.
But
The founding fathers were brilliant. They knew
well,
Americans.
Yeah, well,
general
we've only had to
population was
amend the
stupid.
Constitution a few times, Bruce, so they weren't that brilliant. They also thought 3/5 of a person was a good idea for all the slaves, right?
Yeah.
Come on.
No, I didn't say that it's brilliant that they did. I'm saying they put that in.
they did, but it is because at the time they had a suspicion of the masses, right? Their view of people that should run the country were white landowners,
No, that's right.
right?
Well,
White male landowners. What we've seen through history, though, through the last 200 years of American experience, is an expansion of that right. And I think that's kind of directionally correct if we want to become a democracy. The challenge that where I'm gonna push back to Richard is information exists. I mean, your effort is great. There's Ballotpedia also, which does a great work around this stuff. But information is generally useful to the people that are seeking out the information. And the
Agreed.
thing is that by the time you're seeking out the information, you're already engaged in the process. You're already ready to make a decision. I think if there's one thing that I'm hopeful about in the last election, it is not necessarily that Biden won, but it is the fact that we probably had one of the largest turnout, period, from both sides in an election, right? That people participated in the process. And that hopefully can start getting people on board with the idea of government matters. Yeah. And the next step is, well, how do we keep them from just thinking that government matters only every 4 years?
Right.
Because really, at the end of the day, the presidential race, yeah, that's an interesting race, but that's going to have less impact than some of the local races that really have an impact where nobody actually shows up.
So I wonder how tech got people to vote. I mean, I wonder how tech played their part.
So I think this is kind of where it's interesting. This, right, Zoom, was probably one of the great ways. I was part of an effort called 2020 Victory on the Democrat side, where we leveraged Slack to organize call banks. Because at the end of the day, the tech that actually works best is the tech that connects people, and that's phones, that's texting. During a pandemic, that's basically what gets people to connect, as opposed to just having walk lists and going and knocking on doors and talking to people directly. I mean, what wins election is not necessarily technology directly. There's not like a direct link, but it is technology enabling people to connect.
No, and as a professor, and I see students who have the most, in terms of life remaining, that is going to be affected by decisions, the most to give, and you see that their turnout is so low. If you look at the basic Pareto principle, like people over 65, 80% vote, under 25, only 20%. Why is that? But one thing I noticed in this year, and I asked them, is because things of technology that Tristan was talking about, like texting, nudging, did you vote? Do you need me to go vote with you? Do you need a ride to vote? So that factor helped, not in the voting itself. Some things on voting, unfortunately, that'll be done away because it encourages more people to vote, like the voting by mail. You could track, I requested a ballot, I see that, the ballot received, I returned the ballot, I see that it was returned, it was processed, does it need to be remediated, like was there an error? So technology helps there. And just a quick thought, we love technology, disruptive technologists, and I think the focus should be on the problem technology is solving, whether that's convenience, verification, speed, trust in the system, etc. But, looking at the last election, who would have thought that having our election spread out to 50 different states and having paper ballots would be what saves the democracy, to be a little extreme. Imagine if we had one centralized place where everything was done electronically and was controlled by the federal government. I think we'd be looking at something simple. So, this idea that 50 states with 50 different rules, using paper ballots is what, sorry, I think saved us.
Yeah, it's really sad that we have a tech disrupted democracy, but the whole thing is that the tech that disrupted it this time was, like Tristan said, phones and emails.
Low tech.
It's low tech. You realize that after the 2000 election, there was a discussion about, we need to use technology to improve voting. And so the Help America Vote Act was passed, and it said you need to digitize voting. I don't know
That's
how
not
many.
what the Help America Vote Act said, Tristan.
Well, that was one of the
No,
components.
they wanted assistance to upgrade voting systems. They wanted to get more training to local officials. I mean, there were a lot of things that needed to be done, and that Congress was blocked from funding even more. So we ended up with Facebook, Zuckerberg giving money, but they didn't want to digitize. They wanted to upgrade.
They wanted to
I don't know what you
upgrade.
mean by digitize.
Well, so they wanted to upgrade, and a lot of constituencies read that as digitize, where you ended up with basically the halfway model that we've got today of, scanning machines and those types of models.
As opposed, well, if
But-
you're using paper as a backup, it's fine.
Yes, it is. But what I'm trying to say is that there's always this rush to saying, oh, tech is going to save the day.
Yeah.
But the reality is that in a lot of those cases, tech is not really what saves the day. There's a lot of more critical components that need to be put in place before tech can be applied. Tech is a tool, and tech can be applied properly and can be applied improperly. But oftentimes trying to think of tech as the magic bullet that is going to save our electoral process is not the right way to approach the problem.
I agree.
Mm-hmm.
So just a few minutes left. You've hit upon one point several times, and in fact, you just came back to it, Tristan. Thank you. Tech is just a tool. What can we do when that tool is used in inappropriate ways? Do the owners of the tool bear any responsibility for that? And just, for example, using a tool to do pump and dump of an obscure stock, for example, just pulling one out of random.
GameStop.
So that's actually a very good question. I keep going back and forth on Section 230, right, which is what everybody's going to start talking about when it comes to those issues, and whether the platforms, the Twitters and the Facebooks of this world, have a responsibility to control their environment. But in order to really understand how Section 230 came about, you have to start looking at the history. At the time, the online forums, which were like AOL, CompuServe, Prodigy, were regulating speech on their platform. And in regulating that speech, they were also being held responsible for all speech on their platform as a result, were being sued for it. And that's how we ended up with Section 230 as a way to kind of protect them from being sued for all speech on platforms that they didn't necessarily fully 100% control. So doing away with Section 230 completely is not necessarily the right approach, because it's going to get us back to the same scenario as before. And it's going to probably lead to the platforms actually censoring speech. where under the guise of saying, well, we're now controlling speech because we have to, they're going to go, well, that speech is not speech that we agree with. And so the question is, where do you draw that line? It's really interesting, actually, to me, looking at how Twitter is looking at things versus how Facebook has been looking at things. Because Twitter's approach has been to label speech. Say, this is, up until the deplatforming of Trump, it was really like putting a tag saying, there's no veracity to the statement, but if you want to read the statement, it's still there. And I think that there's something interesting to the approach that they're taking to kind of label stuff. And with their new, I don't remember the name of it, but they just launched a new product on the platform that allows for mass research around this kind of stuff, mass labeling basically of tweets. There's potentially an opportunity there where it's not going to convince people, you're not going to necessarily convince people, but hopefully you can slow down the untruth. Because I think the genie's out of the box.
I know that there's very little time, but there's one question from one of our attendees, Harvey, and he said, can tech assist in creating a better informed electorate? I think, Richard, that would go directly to you. Can tech do that?
Absolutely. I mean, that's exactly what we're trying to do, is just provide transparency issue by issue on all the topics as to what's going on and how your politicians are voting. And so what we plan to do as we evolve is to give data back to the voting electorate, right? So we want to give them information as to, okay, here are the top 3 issues in this state. These are the top 3. Here are the top 3 issues in your voting, in your congressional district, so that people can start to follow them. And going back to the point of a direct democracy, the ideal situation or scenario is we provide the people of a district with enough information that they can then begin to curate what they want in their district for themselves, and then ask their congressman to go get it. And that becomes the necessary function, as opposed to this model that, in my view, is sort of like, it's quasi like the model that you have in China, where you have a small group of people who, 350 people who say, we know what's best for the 1.3 billion people in our country. And so we are entrusting these politicians to know what's inherently best for them. That's why we're electing people based on values and whether or not they're married and have a dog and a minivan and things that really we shouldn't care about, right? And make it hard for diversity to exist. I think that this is that provides a bit of a problem. We should, if we're using data in an agnostic way, people could get the clarity that they want, the information that they want. They can then take that information and actually do something with it, and then really be responsible for it. And then, to the point that Tristan made, we have to have a consistent engagement in between election cycles. And even if it's a small group of people, that's fine, as long as it is a statistically significant sample size that reflects the values of a particular congressional district or state.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Fascinating. Certainly a lot of gist for further thought. So just as a last announcement, thank you everybody for attending tonight. We're looking forward to seeing you at the next webinar coming up in the spring on FinTech. Watch the mailing list for details of date and time. Thank you again, Richard and Bruce and Micah and Tristan, and Lauren, of course, and Jim behind manning the controls. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
And see you next time.
Good to see
See you
you
in
all.
a couple months. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.